Step into the life of Wallis Simpson, the Baltimore-born socialite whose very name shook the foundations of the British monarchy. Born in a remote Pennsylvania mountain town under a cloud of whispered controversy, Wallis spent her youth swaying between financial uncertainty and moments of unexpected privilege. Her bold personality crystallized early. She found herself traversing the globe, escaping an abusive first marriage, and diving headlong into a second one that brought her to the heart of London's high society. Yet, it was her fateful connection with Edward VIII, a newly crowned king besotted with this twice-divorced American, that ignited a constitutional crisis unlike anything the modern world had seen. In this riveting exploration, we follow Wallis's journey from a neglected, fatherless child to the Duchess of Windsor, a woman who provoked both derision and admiration in equal measure. You'll witness her exiled romance, the notorious links to Nazi Germany, and her final, haunting years in Paris under the grip of exploitation and isolation, all testifying to one of history's most compelling royal sagas. Picture a sultry summer afternoon sometime around June 19th, 1896, in a little mountain enclave called Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania. The warm air is thick with humidity, and the dusty main street holds only a few curious onlookers passing by. Inside a modest cottage sits a feeble man named Teakle Wallis Warfield. He's coughing painfully, struggling with the advanced stages of tuberculosis, trying to summon enough strength to stay awake for the birth of his first child. His marriage to Alice Montague 7 months earlier had been a hushed affair. Locals whispered that the couple raced to the altar because of a pregnancy. And now, in that dimly lit bedroom, the midwife announces, "It's a girl." Bessie Wallis Warfield. So begins the story of the woman who would later be known worldwide as Wallis Simpson, a name that would rock the British monarchy to its core. Childhood often sets the tone for a person's entire life, and Wallis's early years were a strange mixture of scarcity and glimpses of splendor. Her father, Teakle, died just 5 months after she was born, leaving her mother, Alice, widowed and financially adrift. They moved in with her paternal grandmother, Anna Warfield, in Baltimore. Anna, though not wealthy, indulged baby Wallis with small treats, taking the child on short shopping excursions in the city. These were some of Wallis's fondest early memories. But Anna shared the household with Uncle Saul Solomonfield, a man whose name bore some political clout. He was a shrewd financier and had a hand in local politics, which gave him power to support or neglect the Warfield women as he pleased. Whenever any whim of his was challenged, he threatened to cut them off, forcing Alice and the young Wallis to tread carefully. Eventually, mother and daughter left that oppressive environment, scraping by in a budget hotel where Alice tried her best to raise her child with dignity, even if it meant selling her handiwork to put food on the table. An unexpected lifeline arrived when Aunt Bessie Merriman, Alice's widowed sister, invited them to stay in her home. This move proved fortuitous for Wallis. Under Aunt Bessie's roof, she began attending local schools, Miss O'Donnell's, then the Arundel School, where she demonstrated a knack for reading, writing, and socializing. Uncle Saul still loomed in the background, demanding that she bring him her school reports, presumably so he could pass judgment on her progress. But at least there was a semblance of stability. Even so, life within those walls was far from lavish. Money always felt precarious, like a thin sheet of ice underfoot. As she later recalled, the difference between having a new dress for a party and going without was often a matter of whether Uncle Saul's mood was good that month. Then came her big leap to Old Fields, an expensive finishing school near Baltimore, known for training the daughters of society's elite. The tuition, eye-popping for that era, was rumored to have been covered partly by extended family and partly by Uncle Saul's grudging checks. At Oldfields, teenage Wallis soon acquired a reputation. She was athletic, playing basketball with fiery enthusiasm, but she also had a rebellious streak. Tired of midnight curfews, she'd sometimes climb out of a second-floor window to meet a boy after hours. Her housemistress gave her repeated warnings, but she seemed immune to caution, brimming with the sort of confidence that draws both admirers and critics. Fellow students recalled her telling stories in a brash, almost aggressive manner, laced with a wit that could amuse or wound. By 1916, aged 19, Wallis found herself invited to stay with a cousin in Florida, near a naval air station. The Great War was raging across the Atlantic, but the Florida sunshine offered a distracting slice of paradise. Young naval officers from the base frequently appeared at dances and social gatherings, hungry for a moment of relief from the war atmosphere. Among them was Lieutenant Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr., known as Win. Handsome, about 8 years older than Wallis, and an experienced pilot who'd seen a fair share of tragedies. Within weeks of their meeting, Win proposed. She, never one to shy from bold decisions, accepted, with the condition that her family must also approve. The wedding took place November 8, 1916. Society columns in Florida and Baltimore reported on it, but behind the scenes there were those who doubted the match's longevity. Their honeymoon painted a grim foreshadowing of reality. Win, who had once impressed Wallis with his gallantry, revealed an ugly side. He was an alcoholic, prone to blackouts, and in that first month after the wedding, he lost control. He'd disappear on all-night binges, return furious, and direct his rage at her in horrifying ways, burning cherished family photos in front of her, or locking her in a room for hours. Family and friends whispered that boys will be boys. But Wallis saw no boyish mischief in these rages. They lived a peripatetic life, bouncing from posting to posting, each shift only intensifying his cruelty. In 1920, she moved out, determined to divorce. But the taboo surrounding divorce, especially for a naval officer's wife, was immense. She relented and reunited with him in Washington, briefly hoping for a fresh start. That hope died quickly. One evening, after an especially brutal episode where he locked her in a bathroom until dawn, she resolved to end the marriage, whatever the social cost. Her mother and Aunt Bessie denounced the plan, calling it disgraceful, but she felt there was no alternative. In 1924, Win was assigned to the Far East. After months of separation, he coaxed her to join him in Hong Kong. She arrived, perhaps holding on to a thin thread of optimism. For a few weeks, Win seemed reformed. He cut back on drinking and showered her with contrition. But by the time they reached Peking, he'd reverted. She accused him of paranoid jealousy, of humiliating her in front of other naval officers. One day, she left him permanently, traveling alone to Shanghai, and then Peking, immersing herself in the intrigues of the city's diplomatic circles and grand social events. She later called this her Lotus Year, a period of personal discovery free from Win's suffocating control. Eventually, she returned stateside in 1925, divorced him in 1927, and emerged with a hardened resolve not to be trapped again. Uncle Saul's death that same year left her largely without familial financial support. She moved to New York, bunking with her friend Mary Kirk, half-heartedly scanning the job market. She loathed the idea of office work, despised the mechanical click of typewriters, and yearned for a more glamorous life. Introductions through Mary led her to Ernest Simpson, an Anglo-American shipping executive who was, inconveniently, already married. They began an affair, eventually leading him to seek his own divorce. By July 1928, Wallis and Ernest married in a grey civil ceremony at a Chelsea registry office. She called it dreary, yet soon found contentment in the everyday security he offered. He was courteous, bookish, and, by her standards, a reliable anchor in a tumultuous world. They relocated to London, renting and later buying a home that she decorated with transatlantic flair. She orchestrated dinner parties that merged American informality with European sophistication. Early on, English high society found her brash. She'd tell bawdy jokes, flout certain British etiquettes, but over time, she earned a niche as that vivacious American hostess. She was a lady with a knack for wisecracks, someone who could host 4 dinner parties in a single week and still greet each guest with unwavering zeal. In 1929, tragedy struck anew. Her mother lost her life after being financially ruined by the Wall Street crash. Wallis returned from the funeral emotionally drained, channeling her heartbreak into perfecting her London home. The name Wallis Simpson began cropping up in minor gossip columns, praising her bold color choices for drapes or her unorthodox amuse-bouche served at soirees. In January 1931, her life would pivot again. A mutual friend, Thelma Furness, extended an invitation to a fox hunt, hinting that Edward, the Prince of Wales, might attend. Edward, already 36, was known as a playboy prince, trailing rumors of romances and disclaimers from his father, King George V, about his unfitness to rule. On the morning of the fox hunt, Wallis worried about what to wear, how to speak. She found him affable but superficial. He prattled on about horses and protocol. Yet, unknown to her, she'd sparked his curiosity with her no-nonsense manner. Soon, Edward was showing up at the Simpson house for tea, for suppers, or simply to chat. Ernest found the prince's visits flattering, never suspecting the emotional intensity that Edward would soon invest in Wallis. By 1932, the Prince of Wales was an almost daily fixture in their household. He telephoned to discuss trivial matters, like which tailor to use or how to prepare a certain dish, just to hear her voice. The social circle explained it away. She's chaperoning Thelma's relationship with the prince. But as months passed, Edward seemed to drop Thelma altogether, focusing solely on Wallis. She confided in friends that she adored the attention, but feared scandal. Her aunt penned anxious letters, urging her to remember the fiasco of her first marriage. Meanwhile, Edward was unstoppable. He pressed her to attend the events he hosted, showering her with tokens of appreciation, from flowers to little pieces of jewelry. By 1934, it was obvious to anyone in the room that the prince was enthralled. Then, January 1936 arrived, and King George V died, making Edward the new monarch, King Edward VIII. Instead of pulling back from controversy, he ramped up his closeness with Wallis, inviting her on out-of-town skiing trips, private dinners at Fort Belvedere, and walks through palace corridors. The British establishment grew uneasy. They could handle a fling, but Edward seemed intent on something deeper. Archbishops quietly reminded him that, as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, he couldn't marry a twice-divorced woman. Cabinet ministers murmured that the monarchy would be imperiled. Wallis sensed the walls closing in, especially after newspapers in the U.S. started fixating on the king and his paramour. In Britain, a press silence initially prevailed. Editors enforced a self-censorship, but the public rumor mill churned ceaselessly. In July 1936, while Ernest was away in Paris, she wrote him a letter saying she'd decided on a divorce. This triggered humiliating legal proceedings. The official hearing took place in Ipswich, concluding in minutes with Ernest effectively admitting to adultery. On the same day her divorce was finalized, Edward summoned Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin to Buckingham Palace and declared he planned to marry her. Baldwin balked. The church objected. The new king stood firm. Her name began dominating headlines. "American divorcee to wed the king!" Political cartoons lampooned her. Outside her London flat, protesters gathered. Some simply curious, others enraged. Rocks flew through her windows. Venomous letters arrived daily. Desperate, she fled to France in December, hoping distance might diffuse the tension. Edward phoned her relentlessly, vowing that if the government forced him to choose, he would abdicate rather than lose her. Terrified, she begged him to reconsider. She didn't want to be the cause of toppling a 900-year-old monarchy. Yet, come December 10th, 1936, Edward signed the abdication instrument. Next day, he addressed the nation. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." In that one broadcast, the monarchy changed forever. Wallis was in a small villa in France, listening to the radio, tears streaming down her cheeks. She believed Edward's impulsive nature was manipulated by key politicians who wanted to remove a difficult king. She wrote letters to old friends describing how she felt like a scapegoat, a figure in a grand chess game, used to orchestrate a bloodless coup. But there was no turning back. Now Edward was the Duke of Windsor, and she, an object of global fascination. They reunited in May 1937, and on June 3, 1937, they wed at the Château de Condé in the Loire Valley. Hardly anyone of note attended, certainly no one from the royal family. The king, now George VI, made it official that she wouldn't have the style of Her Royal Highness. Edward railed against this slight, but it was the new royal decree. Their honeymoon felt hollow. Her old friend Mary Kirk noted she seemed more exhausted than euphoric, gliding from one photo session to another, gamely trying to keep spirits high. The couple's life in exile saw them drifting across Europe, from villas in France to near-permanent hotel suites in Austria and the Riviera. In October 1937, they made their ill-fated visit to Nazi Germany, meeting Goebbels, Himmler, Ribbentrop, even sitting down with Adolf Hitler at his retreat. The international press gasped. Some interpreted this as Edward's naive attempt at diplomacy, while others branded them as Nazi sympathizers. From that point on, the British government grew even warier, especially once the Second World War loomed. In 1939, Edward was assigned as the governor of the Bahamas, far away from the European theater. Wallis joined him, calling the islands a wretched dump, though she busied herself raising funds for the Red Cross, organizing charitable events, and setting up a women's clinic. Locals in Nassau recall her as surprisingly warm, though she openly complained about the climate and the impoverished conditions she saw. As the war ended, they returned to Europe, living in a form of suspended animation. The royal family had no desire to grant Edward a public role, so the Windsors lived off an allowance and the proceeds from their memoirs. A King's Story by Edward. The Heart Has Its Reasons by Wallis. They settled in France, eventually purchasing a house in Paris, hosting small dinners for loyal friends. She was still the talk of society columns, but the tone changed over time. Some described her as brittle, scolding, and perpetually dieting to remain slender. Others insisted she was capable of real kindness, especially to staff members she liked. She and Edward seemed locked in a codependent relationship. She could speak harshly to him in front of guests, yet he, nearly worshipful, obeyed her every whim. Edward's health declined in the late 1960s, culminating in a throat cancer diagnosis. The last months of his life saw him largely confined to their Paris house, with occasional visits from the royal family, including the Queen, who came quietly to see her uncle. He died in May 1972. The funeral took place at Windsor, with Wallis attending, escorted by the newly minted circles of protocol. The Queen allowed her to stay at Buckingham Palace, but the atmosphere was awkward. The older royals kept their distance, giving polite nods but little warmth. After that, Wallis's life turned into an even bleaker exile. With Edward gone, she was an aging duchess in a massive Paris home. Her health worsened. She suffered from narrowing arteries, occasional bouts of confusion. Enter Suzanne Bloom, the French lawyer who offered assistance but ended up controlling Wallis's finances and personal life. Bloom systematically isolated her from her circle, dismissing staff who'd served the Duchess loyally for years, forging questionable documents to gain publishing rights to Wallis's letters and personal archives. Former companions tried visiting, only to be told the Duchess was indisposed. She was by then too frail to protest effectively, sometimes not recognizing day from night. Bloom replaced her valuables with cheaper knockoffs, sold or hoarded her jewelry, and withheld her beloved pets. In the final months, Wallis's confusion grew. She barely ate, drifted in and out of lucidity, sometimes calling out for Edward as if he were in the next room. She believed she still had guests to entertain, though the corridors stood silent. Nurses hired by Bloom reported that the Duchess was kept in near isolation, at times forced to sign legal documents she didn't understand. When she fell and broke her hip, medical treatment was delayed, compounding her discomfort. And thus, on April 24, 1986, at 89 years old, Wallis Simpson died in that Paris house, quietly, overshadowed by the controversies of her youth, overshadowed too by the decades that had passed. Her funeral took place in St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Senior royals attended, but only about 200 people in total. It was a respectful ceremony, but notably, no one uttered her name during the service. Afterward, she was buried near Frogmore, next to the Duke of Windsor, the man who had forsaken a crown for her. Some observers recounted that the Queen, known for her composure, wiped away a single tear, a fleeting moment of recognition that this woman, for all her flaws, had become an inextricable part of the monarchy's modern saga.